The early hours of July 28, 1976 seem no different from any other summer morning in Tangshan, a growing industrial city in northeastern China. Positioned in Hebei province, Tangshan was home to approximately 1 million people, many of whom were miners, factory workers, and their families. Life hummed along with an air of routine. Few could have imagined that this ordinary day would soon become etched in history as the setting for one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. At precisely 3:42 a.m., an earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was located just 12 kilometers beneath the surface, a shallow depth that would amplify its destructive power. The region's geological makeup played a critical role in the disaster. Tangshan was situated on loose sedimentary soil, which exacerbated the seismic waves as they radiated outward. These amplified tremors turned the earth beneath the city into a rolling, heaving force of devastation. Adding to the catastrophe, Tangshan's urban development was not prepared for such a seismic event. The city lacked earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and many of its buildings were constructed from unreinforced masonry and other substandard materials. This left them vulnerable to collapse under the earthquake's immense force. When the quake struck, entire city blocks were razed in seconds, leaving little standing in its wake. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. Entire families were buried beneath rubble as buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets buckled, bridges snapped, and water mains ruptured, flooding parts of the city and making rescue efforts even more challenging. The ground itself became a hazard as fissures opened up, swallowing anything or anyone in their path. Communication lines were severed, isolating Tangshan from the outside world and delaying the flow of critical information about the scale of the disaster. The timing of the earthquake added to the tragedy. Striking while most residents were asleep in their homes, the death toll skyrocketed as people were caught completely off guard. Survivors later recounted how they were jolted awake by violent shaking, only to be engulfed by collapsing walls and falling debris. Darkness, chaos, and confusion overwhelmed the city as cries for help echoed into the night. Despite its seismic significance, there were no foreshocks to serve as a warning. While some animals reportedly exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before the quake, such as dogs barking incessantly and livestock acting erratically, these signs were not enough to prompt human action. This absence of clear warning further underscores the unexpected nature of the disaster. In the hours following the quake, Tangshan's true plight remained hidden from the world. Limited communication and China's tightly controlled media meant that the full scale of the disaster would not emerge immediately. For now, Tangshan's residents were left to grapple with the immense destruction and loss, unaided and largely unnoticed by the outside world. This marked the beginning of a disaster whose ripple effects would extend far beyond its epicenter, reshaping disaster response, preparedness, and urban planning in China and beyond. As the clock struck 3:42 in the early hours of late July, the peaceful city of Tangshan, still shrouded in the stillness of night, was torn apart by a seismic upheaval unlike anything its residents had experienced. The earthquake's force was swift, brutal, and uncompromising, generating seismic waves that spread destruction across a staggering area of over 3,000 square kilometers. The ground heaved violently, transforming solid earth into a liquid-like phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, a catastrophic process that caused buildings to tilt, sink, or collapse entirely. While the epicenter was located within Tangshan, the earthquake's effects radiated far beyond the city. Surrounding towns and rural areas were hit hard, with entire communities flattened in mere seconds. Structures ranging from modest village homes to industrial facilities crumbled under their relentless vibrations. The region's coal mines, a vital part of Tangshan's economy, were particularly devastated, trapping hundreds of workers underground. For those miners, survival became a race against time as tunnels caved in, cutting off both air and escape routes. The damage extended to critical infrastructure, further compounding the chaos. Railways were twisted into grotesque shapes, severing vital transportation links. Power plants were rendered inoperable, plunging the area into darkness, while water pipelines shattered, leaving survivors without clean water. Bridges that once connected the city to nearby regions were reduced to piles of twisted steel and concrete, isolating Tangshan further from external aid. One of the earthquake's most haunting aspects was its sheer speed. Experts later estimated that the most intense shaking lasted less than 15 seconds, yet the destruction it wrought was monumental. This brevity meant that those who might have reacted to the tremors had virtually no time to escape. Survivors described the moments of impact as akin to an apocalyptic storm, walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and the air filling with a deafening roar as the ground moved beneath them. Adding to the horror, the earthquake struck during a heat wave, compounding the physical and emotional toll on survivors. Temperatures soared, and without shelter, clean water, or medical supplies, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Many were forced to endure the blistering heat while searching for loved ones or trying to rescue neighbors trapped beneath the rubble. The sweltering conditions also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, posing significant health risks and further traumatizing those who remained. Another tragic element of the disaster was the widespread loss of life among children. Many schools in Tangshan were not built to withstand even minor earthquakes, let alone a seismic event of this magnitude. As a result, countless young lives were lost when classrooms collapsed, burying students and teachers under tons of debris. These heart-wrenching scenes left an indelible scar on the community and would later fuel demands for stricter building regulations and earthquake preparedness. Meanwhile, survivors faced a terrifying landscape of ruin. Fires broke out across the city as ruptured gas lines ignited, creating an additional hazard for those navigating the wreckage. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the cries of those in pain or mourning their losses. Every moment was a test of resilience as individuals banded together to lift debris, carry the injured to makeshift medical stations, or dig with their bare hands in desperate attempts to find loved ones. Despite the enormity of the disaster, Tangshan's plight initially remained largely unknown to the outside world. The destruction of communication lines and the isolated nature of the region created a chilling silence that left even neighboring cities unaware of the unfolding tragedy. For the people of Tangshan, this isolation deepened their sense of abandonment, as it became clear that immediate help was not on the way. These early hours marked a critical juncture in what would become one of history's most significant natural disasters, setting the stage for an unparalleled story of survival, loss, and resilience. The devastation caused by the Tangshan earthquake unfolded on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, creating a vast expanse of destruction where homes, schools, factories, and hospitals once stood. Over 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed, leaving the majority of Tangshan's population without shelter. The widespread collapse of infrastructure compounded the chaos, forcing survivors to confront a harsh and unforgiving reality in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. The industrial heart of Tangshan, once a bustling hub of economic activity, was obliterated. Factories that powered the region's economy lay in ruins, and heavy machinery was scattered like toys across the landscape. Among the hardest hit were coal mines, which suffered catastrophic collapses, burying hundreds of workers deep underground. These miners faced a desperate battle for survival, contending with toxic gas, flooding, and the ever-present risk of further cave-ins. Hospitals and medical facilities critical for treating the injured were not spared. Most were destroyed, and those that remained operational were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift medical centers sprang up in open fields and among the debris, staffed by a few doctors and nurses who survived. Supplies of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages were woefully inadequate, forcing medical workers to improvise treatments and prioritize the most critical cases. With the injured numbering in the tens of thousands, triage became a grim and inescapable task. Amidst the destruction, survivors faced immense challenges in securing basic necessities. Access to clean water was nearly non-existent, as pipelines had been shattered and wells contaminated. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, leaving many to scavenge through the wreckage or share meager rations. The summer heat exacerbated these hardships, with temperatures soaring above 37 degrees Celsius, further threatening the health of those already weakened by injury or exhaustion. Survivors banded together in an incredible display of human resilience and solidarity. Men, women, and even children took part in rescue efforts, using bare hands and simple tools to dig through the rubble. Makeshift teams formed spontaneously, driven by the shared hope of finding loved ones alive beneath the debris. Tragically, the majority of those trapped could not be saved, as the sheer scale of destruction and the lack of heavy rescue equipment hindered these efforts. The earthquake also inflicted devastating emotional wounds. Families were torn apart as countless lives were lost in an instant. The grief of those who survived was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the fate of their loved ones. Makeshift memorials began appearing within days, with survivors placing flowers, candles, and personal mementos near the sites where friends and family had perished. Adding to the catastrophe, aftershocks continued to terrorize the region. These tremors, some significant in their own right, caused further collapses and heightened the fear of those already traumatized by the initial quake. For the residents of Tangshan, the ground beneath them seemed permanently unstable, and each aftershock was a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. As word of the disaster began to spread beyond Tangshan, nearby towns and villages grappled with their own losses. The destruction was not confined to the city alone. Smaller communities were equally devastated, though their struggles often went unnoticed in the shadow of Tangshan's catastrophe. These areas faced similar shortages of water, food, and medical supplies, further straining the limited resources available for relief efforts. In these early days, survival was a test of willpower and ingenuity. The residents of Tangshan and its surrounding areas displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, setting the stage for a long and arduous recovery. The city's ruins bore silent witness to the resilience of its people, even as the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. In the months and years following the Tangshan earthquake, the true extent of the disaster became a defining moment in modern Chinese history. The challenges of rebuilding a shattered city, addressing the emotional scars of survivors, and honoring the memory of those lost created a legacy that would shape Tangshan and its people for generations. The Chinese government launched an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Within days of the disaster, engineers and construction crews from across the country descended on Tangshan. Entire neighborhoods were cleared of debris, and temporary shelters were erected to house the displaced population. Despite limited resources, the reconstruction process reflected a commitment to rebuilding not just the city's infrastructure, but its spirit. By the early 1980s, Tangshan began to transform into a symbol of resilience and recovery, with new buildings rising in place of the ruins. Public health initiatives also became a cornerstone of the post-disaster response. The widespread destruction of hospitals and sanitation facilities had led to fears of disease outbreaks. Medical teams worked tirelessly to vaccinate survivors and improve living conditions in temporary camps. Over time, Tangshan emerged as a model for public health planning in the aftermath of disasters, influencing emergency response strategies across China. For the survivors, the earthquake left deep psychological wounds. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the disaster. Community support networks played a crucial role in helping individuals process their grief. Over the years, storytelling, art, and cultural events became powerful tools for healing, allowing survivors to share their experiences and honor the memories of loved ones. The Tangshan earthquake also catalyzed advancements in earthquake research and preparedness. The scale of destruction highlighted the need for improved building standards and stricter enforcement of construction codes. By the 1990s, Tangshan's new structures were built to withstand earthquakes, reflecting lessons learned from the tragedy. The disaster also spurred the development of early warning systems and a nationwide focus on earthquake education, which have since saved countless lives. Globally, the Tangshan earthquake drew attention to the importance of international solidarity in the face of natural disasters. Although China largely relied on internal resources, offers of aid from other countries marked a significant shift in global disaster response dynamics. The tragedy underscored the shared vulnerability of humanity and the need for collective action to mitigate the impact of such events. In Tangshan today, memorials stand as a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of those who survived. The Tangshan Earthquake Memorial Park, completed in the late 20th century, is a place of reflection and remembrance. Its design incorporates remnants of destroyed buildings and poignant sculptures, ensuring that the memory of the disaster remains alive for future generations. The earthquake also left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It inspired literature, film, and academic studies, shaping the way disasters are understood and discussed. The stories of survival and courage from Tangshan resonate far beyond the city, serving as a reminder of humanity's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. As the decades have passed, Tangshan has risen from its darkest moment to become a thriving city once again. Its recovery is a testament to the resilience of its people, the power of community, and the lessons learned from one of history's most devastating natural disasters. The legacy of the Tangshan earthquake is not merely one of destruction, but also of rebuilding, healing, and hope for a better future. In the autumn of 1979, meteorologists monitoring the Pacific Ocean began to notice the early signs of what would become one of the most powerful tropical cyclones in recorded history. It all started with a tropical disturbance near the Marshall Islands. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a cluster of thunderstorms brewing in warm ocean waters. But as the system began to organize, meteorologists could see it was no ordinary storm. The warm waters of the Pacific Ocean, combined with favorable atmospheric conditions, provided the perfect environment for the disturbance to develop. Sea surface temperatures in the region were unusually high, exceeding 80 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a vast reservoir of energy. At the same time, low wind shear, a condition where winds at different altitudes are not drastically different in speed or direction, allowed the storm to maintain its structure and grow rapidly. As the storm gathered strength, the Japan Meteorological Agency officially classified it as a tropical depression on October 8, 1979. By October 9th, it had intensified into a tropical storm, earning the name Tip. Over the next few days, Tip's growth was extraordinary. It transformed from a modest tropical storm into a full-fledged typhoon, its spiraling bands of clouds stretching farther and farther across the ocean. By October 11th, Tip reached the status of a super typhoon. At its peak, the storm boasted winds of over 190 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 870 millibars, the lowest ever recorded for a tropical cyclone. These figures alone make Typhoon Tip a meteorological marvel, but the storm's size was equally astonishing. At its largest, Tip's circulation spanned over 1,380 miles in diameter, making it the widest tropical cyclone ever documented. The immense size and power of Tip were not just theoretical measurements, they represented a serious threat to anyone in its path. Meteorologists faced the daunting challenge of predicting where the storm would go and how intense it would become. In an era without modern satellite imagery or advanced computer modeling, this task was as much an art as it was a science. Using weather balloons, aircraft reconnaissance, and early satellite data, they worked tirelessly to track Tip's progress. By mid-October, Tip had become a storm that defied imagination. Its enormous eye, a calm, eerily clear area at the center of the storm, measured over 20 miles across, surrounded by towering walls of clouds where the most violent winds and heaviest rains churned. This was the calm before the chaos, as the typhoon approached areas where its impact would be felt most acutely. Communities across the Western Pacific scrambled to prepare. In Japan and nearby islands like Guam, authorities issued evacuation orders, closed schools and businesses, and braced for the storm's arrival. People boarded up windows, secured their belongings, and sought refuge in designated shelters. Despite the best efforts of forecasters and officials, the sheer scale of Tip's power made it impossible to predict the exact extent of the destruction that lay ahead. Part 1 of this journey into Typhoon Tip's history ends here, with the storm at its peak intensity and a sense of unease hanging heavy over the Pacific. The next part will delve deeper into Tip's path and the impact of this colossal storm on the people and places in its way. As Typhoon Tip reached its peak intensity in mid-October of 1979, its immense size and power set it apart from any storm in recorded history. With its towering clouds, vast wind field, and record-breaking low pressure, Tip became a force of nature that demanded respect and fear. The storm's trajectory was closely monitored as forecasters worked tirelessly to predict its path and issue timely warnings to the regions at risk. Tip began its journey westward across the Pacific, its spiraling arms stretching out over 1,380 miles. The storm churned through open waters, gathering moisture and energy from the warm ocean surface. While the storm's eye remained a quiet center of calm, the surrounding eye wall was a region of unrelenting chaos. Wind speeds soared to over 190 miles per hour, accompanied by torrential rains that poured down in sheets, obscuring visibility and creating treacherous conditions for ships at sea. As the storm moved closer to land, the Japanese island of Guam found itself in Tip's vast outer reach. Although the island was spared a direct hit, it still faced strong winds, heavy rains, and rising seas. Coastal areas were inundated by storm surges, forcing evacuations and leaving residents grappling with power outages and flooded homes. Fishermen scrambled to secure their boats, and emergency responders worked around the clock to protect lives and property. While Guam experienced only a glancing blow, Japan's southern islands braced for the storm's full impact. Typhoon Tip shifted slightly northeast, sparing the most populated regions a direct hit, but still unleashing its fury on the Ryukyu Islands. Strong winds tore through towns, toppling trees and power lines, while torrential rains caused landslides that buried roads and threatened entire villages. At the same time, the storm's massive circulation caused ripple effects far beyond its immediate path. In the Philippines, hundreds of miles away, heavy rains brought by Tip's outer bands triggered flash floods and displaced thousands of families. The storm's sheer size meant that even areas not directly in its path felt its influence, underscoring the far-reaching impact of such a powerful system. Tip's eventual landfall came on October 19, 1979, in Japan's Shikoku region. By this point, the storm had weakened slightly from its record-setting peak, but it remained a formidable typhoon, with winds exceeding 120 miles per hour. Coastal towns bore the brunt of the storm surge, which swallowed entire stretches of shoreline, destroying homes and businesses in its wake. Farther inland, rivers swelled beyond their banks, inundating fields and towns and forcing thousands of residents to flee to higher ground. Throughout the chaos, stories of survival and resilience emerged. Families huddled together in shelters, clinging to hope as the storm raged outside. Emergency services worked tirelessly to rescue stranded residents, wading through floodwaters and navigating debris-strewn streets. The storm's impact on infrastructure was severe, with countless buildings reduced to rubble, roads rendered impassable, and communication networks disrupted. As Tip moved inland and began to lose strength, it left behind a trail of destruction that stretched for hundreds of miles. In the storm's wake, survivors emerged to assess the damage and begin the long process of recovery. Yet even as the winds died down and the rain subsided, the true scale of the disaster was only beginning to become clear. Next, we will explore the aftermath of Typhoon Tip, delving into the human toll, the challenges faced by those left in its path, and the lessons learned from this unprecedented storm. When Typhoon Tip finally dissipated in late October of 1979, the devastation left behind was staggering. Entire communities were unrecognizable, transformed by the relentless winds, rain, and storm surges that had accompanied the storm's passage. For the people who had endured its wrath, the aftermath was a time of reckoning, survival, and rebuilding. In Japan, the storm's impacts were most severe in the Shikoku and Honshu regions. Entire neighborhoods had been submerged by flooding, with homes and businesses reduced to soggy ruins. Farmlands, which were the lifeblood for many communities, were devastated as rivers overflowed, carrying away crops and livestock. Coastal towns suffered extensive damage, with fishing fleets destroyed and ports rendered unusable. One of the most immediate concerns was the displacement of thousands of residents. Shelters quickly filled with families seeking refuge, many of whom had lost everything. In the days following the storm, emergency response teams worked tirelessly to deliver food, clean water, and medical aid to the affected areas. However, the sheer scale of the disaster made it a daunting task. Roads were blocked by landslides and debris, making it difficult for supplies to reach remote locations. The human toll of the storm was deeply felt. Dozens of lives were lost, and many more were injured. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from storm-related injuries, and there was a growing concern about the spread of waterborne diseases due to the contaminated floodwaters. Volunteers and aid organizations rallied to support those in need, but the emotional scars of the disaster were evident in every survivor's story. Beyond the immediate challenges, the long-term effects of Tip were profound. Infrastructure across the region was severely damaged, with roads, bridges, and power lines needing extensive repairs. In some areas, it took weeks or even months to restore electricity and clean water. Schools and public buildings that had been used as evacuation centers required significant renovations before they could reopen. Environmental damage was another pressing issue. Forests along the typhoon's path were left in shambles, with uprooted trees scattered like matchsticks. Coastal erosion altered the landscape, and the storm's intense rainfall led to soil destabilization, increasing the risk of future landslides. Efforts to clean up and repair the damage required coordination between local governments, national agencies, and international aid organizations. As the recovery unfolded, stories of resilience and solidarity emerged. Communities banded together to clear debris, rebuild homes, and support one another through the hardships. Local leaders organized fundraisers and donation drives, while neighboring regions sent resources and manpower to assist in the recovery efforts. Despite the immense challenges, there was a collective determination to overcome the disaster and restore a sense of normalcy. In the months that followed, meteorologists and scientists analyzed Typhoon Tip's unprecedented strength and impact. Its record-breaking size and intensity highlighted the need for improved forecasting technology and disaster preparedness. Governments across the Pacific region began reassessing their emergency response strategies, seeking to learn from Tip's devastating lessons to better protect their citizens in the future. As we wrap up, we will reflect on the legacy of Typhoon Tip, examining how it changed our understanding of tropical cyclones and the ongoing quest to predict and mitigate such powerful forces of nature. Typhoon Tip's story did not end when its winds subsided or the floodwaters receded. Instead, the storm left an enduring legacy, one that reshaped our understanding of tropical cyclones and the ways we prepare for natural disasters. In the decades since Tip's unprecedented arrival in 1979, its lessons have influenced meteorology, disaster management, and public awareness in profound ways. One of the most significant impacts of Typhoon Tip was its contribution to meteorological science. At the time, the storm's size and intensity were unparalleled, pushing scientists to study its unique characteristics. Researchers examined how Tip's interaction with warm ocean waters and atmospheric conditions created the perfect environment for such a colossal storm to form. This research not only deepened our understanding of typhoon dynamics, but also helped improve predictive models, enabling forecasters to anticipate storm behavior with greater accuracy. Tip also highlighted the importance of advancements in storm monitoring technology. In the late 1970s, satellite imagery was still in its early stages, and weather data collection relied heavily on reconnaissance aircraft and surface observations. The challenges of tracking Tip underscored the need for more robust satellite systems, which have since become essential tools in monitoring tropical cyclones worldwide. Today, meteorologists can track storms in real time, providing earlier warnings and saving countless lives. On a societal level, Tip served as a wake-up call for disaster preparedness. Communities and governments across the Pacific Basin recognize the critical importance of early warning systems, evacuation protocols, and infrastructure resilience. In Japan, where the storm's impact was most severe, efforts were made to strengthen coastal defenses, improve flood management systems, and educate the public on how to respond to typhoons. These measures have undoubtedly reduced the toll of subsequent storms in the region. The human stories of Typhoon Tip, of loss, resilience, and recovery, also played a pivotal role in fostering a deeper appreciation for the power of nature. Survivors' accounts of the storm's fury and its aftermath served as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of coastal communities. These narratives helped galvanize support for stronger disaster response programs and greater investment in community preparedness. Globally, Tip's record-breaking intensity became a benchmark in the study of tropical cyclones. The storm's name remains synonymous with extreme weather, and its place in history has influenced how we perceive and respond to similar events. It also spurred international collaboration among scientists, governments, and organizations working together to mitigate the impacts of future storms. While Typhoon Tip was a natural disaster of immense destruction, its legacy is also one of progress and resilience. The storm's unprecedented power challenged humanity to rise to the occasion, to learn from the devastation, and to build a future where we are better equipped to face the forces of nature. The advancements in meteorology, disaster management, and community preparedness that followed in Tip's wake stand as a testament to our ability to adapt and endure. As we reflect on the history of Typhoon Tip, we are reminded of the duality of nature's beauty and its potential for destruction. It is a call to action to respect the environment, prepare for the unpredictable, and remain steadfast in the face of adversity. Typhoon Tip may have been a storm of the past, but its lessons are timeless, serving as a guide for navigating the storms of the future. On May 12, 2008, at precisely 2:28 p.m. local time, the Earth unleashed its fury in one of the most devastating natural disasters in modern Chinese history. A powerful earthquake struck Sichuan province in southwestern China, measuring 8.0 on the Richter scale, according to the China Earthquake Administration. The U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, recorded it as a magnitude 7.9. But regardless of the numbers, the earthquake's strength was monumental. Its epicenter was located in Wenchuan County, approximately 50 miles northwest of Chengdu, the provincial capital. This rural area, surrounded by steep mountains and narrow valleys, became the epicenter of destruction. The quake was caused by the movement along the Longmingshan Fault, a tectonic plate boundary where the Indian and Eurasian plates collide. This fault zone has been geologically active for millions of years, and the immense pressure between these two plates finally gave way, resulting in the massive release of energy. The seismic event caused the ground to rupture along a fault line stretching nearly 240 kilometers, about 150 miles. In some places, the ground shifted laterally by as much as 9 meters, nearly 30 feet. The force released by this earthquake was equivalent to the detonation of multiple nuclear bombs, and its impact was felt across East Asia. What made this earthquake particularly devastating was not just its magnitude, but its shallow depth of only 19 kilometers, about 12 miles. Shallow earthquakes tend to cause more severe surface shaking, amplifying their destructive power. The tremors lasted for about 2 minutes, an eternity for those caught in its grip. It wasn't just a local event. The earthquake sent shock waves across a wide area. People as far away as Beijing, Shanghai, and even Hanoi, Vietnam, over 1,500 kilometers away, reported feeling the ground tremble. The seismic activity didn't just shake the ground, it shook the lives of millions. The towns and villages near the epicenter, including Beichuan, Yingxiu, and Dujiangyan, bore the brunt of the devastation. In Wenchuan County, where the epicenter was located, up to 80% of structures were either damaged or completely destroyed. Schools, homes, hospitals, and government buildings crumbled into heaps of rubble, trapping countless individuals beneath. Roads cracked open, bridges collapsed, and power lines snapped, plunging many areas into darkness. In the span of just a few minutes, bustling communities were reduced to ruin. The earthquake's timing added to the catastrophe. Striking in the early afternoon, many children were at school and workers were inside office buildings. Tragically, thousands of students were killed when their school buildings collapsed, exposing critical flaws in construction standards. This led to widespread anger and heartbreak among parents, who would later refer to these poorly built schools as tofu buildings due to their weak and unstable structures. Within minutes of the main quake, the region was hit by a series of aftershocks, some exceeding a magnitude of 6.0. These aftershocks not only caused additional destruction, but also made it nearly impossible for survivors to seek safety. Landslides triggered by the tremors buried entire villages, dammed rivers, and created quake lakes that pose new threats of flooding. For those who survived the initial shock, the danger was far from over. As news of the earthquake spread, a sense of dread gripped the nation. Sichuan province, known for its breathtaking natural beauty and vibrant culture, was now the epicenter of unimaginable tragedy. For the millions of people affected, life as they knew it had been irrevocably changed. The earthquake wasn't just a geological event, it was a humanitarian crisis that would require an unprecedented response. This catastrophic moment marked the beginning of a period of intense rescue and recovery efforts. But for the people of Sichuan, it was also the beginning of a long and painful journey to rebuild their lives. The Sichuan earthquake of May 12, 2008, was not a random event, but the result of complex geological forces at work over millions of years. To understand why this disaster occurred, one must delve into the tectonic processes that shaped the region and made it a hotspot for seismic activity. Sichuan province is situated near the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, one of the most geologically active regions in the world. The plateau itself was formed as a result of the collision between the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, a process that began approximately 50 million years ago. This slow-motion collision continues today, with the Indian plate pushing northward at a rate of about 5 centimeters, 2 inches per year. This movement generates immense stress along fault lines in the region, particularly the Longmingshan Fault, which runs along the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau and cuts through Sichuan. The Longmingshan Fault is a thrust fault, meaning that one side of the fault is forced upward over the other due to tectonic pressure. Over time, stress builds up along the fault line until it surpasses the strength of the rock, causing the fault to rupture and release energy in the form of an earthquake. In the case of the Sichuan earthquake, the rupture occurred along a 240-kilometer, 150-mile segment of the fault, with the ground on either side shifting violently. This seismic event was classified as a megathrust earthquake, one of the most powerful types of earthquakes. These occur when a massive slab of the Earth's crust is pushed upward, releasing an enormous amount of energy. The Sichuan quake released an estimated 3 exajoules of energy, equivalent to the detonation of nearly 500 million tons of TNT. The ground shaking caused by this release of energy was intense, with peak ground accelerations exceeding 1 g-force in some areas. This level of shaking is strong enough to toss objects into the air and bring down even well-built structures. The timing of the earthquake was particularly unfortunate. It struck at 2:28 in the afternoon when many people were indoors, increasing the likelihood of fatalities and injuries. The rupture was also shallow, occurring at a depth of 19 kilometers, 12 miles. Shallow quakes tend to be far more destructive because the energy they release is concentrated close to the surface, where buildings, infrastructure, and people are located. The geology of the region also played a critical role in amplifying the quake's destructive power. The Sichuan Basin, located just east of the Tibetan Plateau, is filled with loose sedimentary layers that are prone to liquefaction during strong earthquakes. Liquefaction occurs when saturated soils lose their strength and behave like a liquid due to intense shaking. This phenomenon caused buildings to sink or tilt in many areas, further contributing to the devastation. Another factor that worsened the impact was the steep and rugged terrain surrounding the epicenter in Wenchuan County. The mountains in this region are geologically young and composed of fractured rock, making them highly susceptible to landslides during seismic events. The earthquake triggered thousands of landslides, some of which buried entire villages and blocked major rivers. These landslides created what are known as quake lakes, where debris dams rivers, forming temporary reservoirs. In some cases, these quake lakes threatened to burst, putting downstream communities at risk of catastrophic flooding. The earthquake's massive energy release and widespread destruction highlight the inherent vulnerability of the region. Despite being located in a seismically active zone, much of the area was unprepared for such a disaster. Many of the buildings that collapsed were constructed with inadequate materials and methods, unable to withstand the intense shaking. Schools in particular suffered disproportionately high levels of destruction, leading to tragic loss of life among children. In the hours immediately following the earthquake, aftershocks began to ripple through the region. These secondary quakes, some exceeding a magnitude of 6, added to the destruction and hampered rescue efforts. The strongest aftershock occurred on May 27th, measuring 6.4 in magnitude, further destabilizing the already fragile region. Over 178,000 aftershocks were recorded in the months following the main quake, a grim reminder of the ongoing geological instability. The Sichuan earthquake was a stark demonstration of the forces at play beneath the Earth's surface. It revealed the immense power of tectonic processes and the fragile balance that exists between the natural world and human settlements. For the people of Sichuan, this understanding came at a tremendous cost as the ground beneath their feet betrayed them in one of the most devastating ways imaginable. The Sichuan earthquake of May 12, 2008, brought widespread devastation, reshaping entire cities and leaving deep scars on the communities it touched. The quake's epicenter, located near Wenchuan County, saw unparalleled destruction, but its effects rippled out across Sichuan province and beyond, impacting millions of lives. Wenchuan County, home to over 100,000 people, bore the brunt of the earthquake. Entire towns were leveled within seconds as buildings collapsed under the immense forces of the quake. Public facilities, schools, and hospitals were among the hardest hit, their poorly constructed structures unable to withstand the seismic waves. In Beichuan County, another area near the epicenter, over 80% of the buildings were reduced to rubble. The picturesque town of Beichuan, nestled in a valley, was buried under landslides triggered by the quake, erasing it from the map. Larger cities like Dujiangyan, Mianyang, and Chengdu also faced significant damage. In Dujiangyan, a city known for its ancient irrigation system, modern buildings collapsed alongside historical structures. Mianyang, home to millions, saw entire residential complexes pancaked, trapping thousands of people under debris. Even Chengdu, the provincial capital located over 90 kilometers, 56 miles from the epicenter, experienced substantial destruction. Though Chengdu's modern infrastructure fared better than rural areas, older buildings, particularly in densely populated neighborhoods, suffered heavy damage. The human toll was staggering. Official records later confirmed that over 69,000 people lost their lives, but the real number may be even higher. Another 17,575 were reported missing and presumed dead. Beyond this, 374,640 people sustained injuries, many of them life-altering. In some of the hardest-hit areas, entire families were wiped out. Schools, tragically, became the sites of some of the greatest loss of life. In Beichuan Middle School, over 1,000 students and teachers perished when the building collapsed. Across Sichuan province, it is estimated that as many as 5,335 children died in their schools, sparking outrage and calls for accountability over substandard construction practices. These poorly built tofu dreg schools, so named for their fragile, crumbling materials, became symbols of the tragedy. The earthquake severely damaged critical infrastructure, isolating many towns and villages from the outside world. Roads leading to Wenchuan and other affected areas were destroyed by landslides, cutting off access for rescue teams. Bridges collapsed, including the Zipingpu Bridge near Dujiangyan, severing key transportation links. Rail lines were warped, tunnels collapsed, and highways were rendered impassable. Even the Chengdu Shuangliu International Airport experienced disruptions, further delaying relief efforts. Communication networks were also crippled, telephone lines were cut, and mobile towers toppled, leaving millions unable to contact loved ones or call for help. Electricity and water supplies were interrupted in vast swaths of the province. Hospitals, many of which were damaged or destroyed, were overwhelmed with casualties. Makeshift triage centers were set up in streets and parks, but the lack of medical supplies and personnel made it impossible to treat everyone in need. As if the earthquake itself were not enough, its aftermath brought additional hazards. Landslides triggered by the quake buried entire villages and blocked major rivers, creating a series of quake lakes. The largest of these, Tangjiashan Lake, formed when landslides blocked the Jian River near Beichuan County. The rapidly rising water levels posed a grave risk to downstream communities, with fears of catastrophic flooding. Tens of thousands of residents had to be evacuated, as engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly to drain the lake and stabilize the debris dam. The destruction of dams and reservoirs in the region added to the dangers. The Zipingpu Dam, located just a few kilometers from the epicenter, sustained significant structural damage. Had the dam failed, it could have unleashed a devastating flood, further compounding the loss of life and property. In addition to the physical devastation, the earthquake left an emotional scar on the people of Sichuan. Families were torn apart, with many losing loved ones in the blink of an eye. Survivors faced the daunting task of identifying bodies and saying goodbye to those they had lost, often in mass graves or hurried cremations due to health concerns. Cultural heritage sites were also affected. The ancient Dujingyan irrigation system, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, sustained damage, though its primary structures remained intact. Temples, pagodas, and other historical landmarks crumbled, taking with them centuries of history and cultural significance. The scale of destruction shocked not only Sichuan but the entire nation. Within hours of the quake, news of the disaster spread across China, prompting an outpouring of grief and solidarity. Flags were lowered to half-mast and public events were cancelled as the nation mourned its losses. Millions tuned in to broadcasts of rescue efforts, hoping for news of survivors. The immediate aftermath of the Sichuan earthquake revealed the fragility of human life in the face of nature's fury. Cities were shattered, lives were lost, and families were torn apart, leaving a province and a nation reeling from the devastation. But amid the destruction, the resilience of the human spirit began to shine through, setting the stage for the monumental rescue and relief efforts that would follow. The aftermath of the Sichuan earthquake on May 12, 2008 revealed the immense challenges of recovery and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. As the ground stopped shaking, the true scope of the disaster came into focus, setting in motion one of the largest relief efforts in modern history. This final part examines the aftermath of the earthquake, the reconstruction efforts, the long-term impact on affected communities, and the enduring lessons learned. In the hours following the quake, China faced a monumental task: rescuing survivors, caring for the injured, and providing shelter to millions who had lost their homes. The Chinese government, recognizing the unprecedented scale of the disaster, declared a national emergency and mobilized tens of thousands of soldiers, police officers, and volunteers. Helicopters, trucks, and even makeshift rafts were employed to reach isolated areas, often navigating treacherous terrain left unstable by landslides. Time was of the essence. The first 72 hours after an earthquake are critical for rescuing those trapped under debris. Rescuers worked tirelessly, often digging with their hands or rudimentary tools, as heavy machinery could not access many remote locations. Heroic stories emerged, such as the rescue of a young girl pulled from the rubble of Sichuan Middle School after 70 hours. Yet for every life saved, there were countless others lost, their absence leaving families shattered. The disaster prompted an outpouring of support from within China and across the globe. Domestically, citizens and businesses donated money, supplies, and time. In a rare moment of unity, people from all walks of life set aside differences to contribute to the relief efforts. Telethons raised billions of yuan, while food, water, and clothing poured into Sichuan from every corner of the country. Internationally, offers of assistance came from over 100 countries and organizations. Nations such as Japan, the United States, and Russia sent rescue teams, medical personnel, and equipment. The World Health Organization and the Red Cross provided medical supplies and expertise, while the United Nations coordinated logistics to ensure aid reached those most in need. This level of international cooperation underscored the shared humanity that disasters bring to light. One of the most pressing challenges was providing shelter for the over 4 million people left homeless by the earthquake. Temporary tent cities sprang up almost overnight, dotting fields and open spaces across Sichuan. While these shelters provided immediate relief, they lacked basic amenities such as clean water, sanitation, and adequate protection from the elements. Diseases such as dysentery and respiratory infections began to spread, adding another layer of urgency to the relief efforts. The government and aid organizations worked quickly to establish more stable solutions. Prefabricated housing units were erected in large numbers, providing a semblance of normalcy for displaced families. Schools and clinics were set up within these settlements, ensuring children could continue their education and medical needs could be addressed. However, the psychological scars of the disaster were harder to mend. Counseling services were introduced, focusing on children who had witnessed the loss of friends, teachers, and family members. The scale of destruction required a comprehensive, long-term approach to rebuilding. In September 2008, the Chinese government unveiled a massive reconstruction plan with a budget of over 1 trillion yuan, equivalent to approximately $146 billion at the time. The plan aimed to rebuild homes, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure with an emphasis on safety and sustainability. One of the most ambitious projects was the relocation of entire towns. For instance, the devastated town of Beichuan was rebuilt on a new site several kilometers away, with modern earthquake-resistant structures. The old town was preserved as a memorial, a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the power of nature. Other towns and villages were similarly relocated or rebuilt with improved designs to minimize future risks. In addition to physical reconstruction, the government prioritized economic recovery. Subsidies were provided to farmers to replace lost livestock and replant crops, while small businesses received financial assistance to restart operations. Larger industries such as manufacturing and tourism were incentivized to invest in the region, creating jobs and stimulating the local economy. The earthquake left deep emotional scars on survivors, many of whom lost multiple family members. The grieving process was compounded by the sheer scale of the disaster, with entire communities mourning their dead. In response, memorials and monuments were erected across Sichuan. Annual commemorations on May 12th serve as both a remembrance of those who perished and a testament to the resilience of the survivors. In Beichuan, the remains of the old town were turned into a national earthquake memorial site, drawing visitors from around the world. Schools, such as Juyuan Middle School, where hundreds of students lost their lives, became places of pilgrimage, with flowers, photos, and messages left in tribute to the young lives cut short. The Sichuan earthquake exposed weaknesses in building codes and disaster preparedness, prompting significant reforms. Stricter construction standards were implemented nationwide, with an emphasis on ensuring schools, hospitals, and other public buildings could withstand future earthquakes. Emergency response protocols were also overhauled, with greater investment in training, equipment, and public awareness campaigns. The disaster also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in addressing large-scale emergencies. China's openness to foreign assistance during the crisis marked a significant shift in its approach to humanitarian aid, fostering closer ties with global partners. The Sichuan earthquake was one of the most devastating natural disasters in China's history, but it also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. from the heroic efforts of rescuers to the generosity of strangers. The response to the disaster showcased humanity at its best. While the scars of the earthquake remain, the people of Sichuan have rebuilt their lives and communities with determination and hope. The legacy of the earthquake is a reminder of both the fragility of life and the strength that emerges in the face of adversity. For those who lived through it, May 12, 2008, will forever be a day of sorrow and remembrance, but also a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring bonds of humanity. The Bhola Cyclone of 1970 is remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. This catastrophic storm struck the low-lying coastal areas of what was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, with devastating consequences. In the weeks leading up to the cyclone, no one could have predicted the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. This storm would forever change the way the region and the world viewed the threat of cyclones in this vulnerable part of the globe. The story of the Bhola Cyclone begins with the unique geography of Bangladesh. The country is crisscrossed by rivers and bordered by the Bay of Bengal, making it one of the most fertile yet disaster-prone regions in the world. Its flat and low-lying terrain, combined with a population heavily concentrated near the coast, makes it a target for devastating cyclones. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, infrastructure in the region was extremely underdeveloped. Early warning systems were almost non-existent, and the vast majority of the population lived in poorly built homes that offered little to no protection from extreme weather. The vulnerability of the population to cyclones was exacerbated by a lack of awareness and preparedness. Most people in the region relied on traditional knowledge or informal community warnings to determine whether a storm was coming. Unfortunately, in 1970, even these informal networks failed to provide the necessary warnings. Many communities remained unaware of the growing danger until it was far too late to evacuate to safer areas. Adding to the vulnerability was the political context of the time. East Pakistan was struggling under neglectful governance by the central authorities in West Pakistan, leading to significant disparities in resource allocation and disaster management infrastructure. This lack of investment in coastal defenses, emergency shelters, and public awareness campaigns created the perfect conditions for a large-scale human tragedy. By the time the storm began forming over the Bay of Bengal on November 8, 1970, the elements were already stacked against the people of coastal Bangladesh. The warm waters of the bay provided the energy needed to fuel the storm, while the atmospheric conditions allowed it to intensify quickly. As the cyclone grew in strength, it set its sights on one of the most densely populated and vulnerable regions in the world. As the Bhola Cyclone gained strength in the Bay of Bengal during early November of 1970, meteorologists observed the storm with increasing concern. The cyclone's formation was fueled by a dangerous combination of natural factors: warm ocean waters, low atmospheric pressure, and high levels of humidity in the air. These conditions created the perfect environment for the cyclone to rapidly intensify, transforming it into a deadly force. By November 11th, the storm had developed into a Category 3 cyclone, with wind speeds reaching up to 120 kilometers per hour. Despite the growing severity of the storm, communication systems at the time were woefully inadequate. The meteorological agencies monitoring the cyclone faced significant challenges in issuing timely warnings. Advanced tracking technology like satellites was still in its infancy, and many remote areas had no access to radio or other forms of communication. This lack of reliable information made it nearly impossible for officials to warn the population effectively. As the storm approached the coastline, most residents remained unaware of the scale of the danger. The geography of the Bay of Bengal played a critical role in amplifying the storm's impact. The bay's funnel shape naturally directs storm surges toward the coastline, intensifying the force of the water as it nears land. When the Bhola cyclone approached landfall, it pushed an enormous wall of water ahead of it. This storm surge, estimated to be as high as 10 meters, struck the coastal areas of East Pakistan with overwhelming power, inundating entire villages and leaving little chance for survival. On November 12, 1970, the cyclone made landfall near the Meghna River Delta, unleashing its full fury on the densely populated coastline. The storm surge swept through the low-lying islands and coastal plains, submerging vast areas underwater. The combination of powerful winds, relentless rain, and the massive surge created conditions that were impossible to escape. Families in the path of the storm sought refuge wherever they could, on rooftops, in trees, or clinging to debris, but many were overcome by the rising waters. In the immediate aftermath of the cyclone's landfall, the extent of the devastation was difficult to grasp. Entire communities were wiped off the map, and the few survivors who emerged described scenes of utter chaos and destruction. The storm had struck at night, further complicating rescue efforts and leaving survivors disoriented and terrified as they tried to comprehend the scale of the disaster. In the days following the Bhola Cyclone's landfall on November 12, 1970, the scale of the disaster began to emerge, revealing the immense toll it had taken on human life and the region's infrastructure. Reports trickled in from isolated areas, painting a grim picture of destruction and despair. Entire villages were submerged, and survivors were left clinging to life in an unrecognizable landscape. The storm's aftermath exposed not only the physical devastation, but also the harrowing challenges faced by the government and international aid organizations attempting to respond. The cyclone's impact was most severe in the coastal islands and the low-lying delta regions. These areas, densely populated and with little elevation to provide protection, bore the brunt of the storm. An estimated 400,000 people lost their lives, and millions more were left homeless. The sheer scale of the disaster made it one of the deadliest cyclones in recorded history. Survivors described scenes of unimaginable loss, family members swept away by the surge, entire villages flattened by the wind, and bodies strewn across the flooded landscape. One of the most devastating aspects of the cyclone was the breakdown of essential services in its wake. Clean drinking water became nearly impossible to find, as saltwater contamination had infiltrated wells and other freshwater sources. Food supplies were similarly destroyed, with crops submerged under floodwaters and livestock swept away. This created an immediate humanitarian crisis, as survivors faced starvation and disease in the days following the storm. Efforts to bring relief to the affected areas were hampered by the lack of infrastructure and the chaotic conditions. Roads and bridges were destroyed, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach those in need. The few boats available were often insufficient for the task of navigating the flooded areas, and air transport was limited. Relief workers faced monumental challenges as they attempted to deliver food, water, and medical supplies to the survivors scattered across the devastated region. Compounding the crisis was the slow response from the government. At the time, East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, was part of a politically unstable country with a central government based in West Pakistan, more than 1,000 miles away. The geographical distance, combined with political tensions between the two regions, delayed relief efforts and left many survivors feeling abandoned. The lack of immediate action fueled resentment among the affected population and would later play a significant role in the political movements that led to Bangladesh's independence. The environmental toll of the cyclone was equally staggering. Fertile farmland, the lifeblood of many coastal communities, was rendered useless by saltwater intrusion. The flooding disrupted ecosystems, and it would take years for the land to recover fully. The economic devastation was profound, as thousands of families who depended on fishing, farming, and small-scale trade lost their livelihoods overnight. While the world eventually came to learn of the tragedy, the initial international response was slow. News of the cyclone spread gradually, as communication lines were down, and reports took days to reach the global community. When aid finally began to arrive, it was clear that the needs far outweighed the resources available. The devastation caused by the Bhola cyclone became a haunting reminder of the vulnerability of coastal communities and the urgent need for better disaster preparedness. In the years following the catastrophic Bhola cyclone of November 1970, the event became a turning point for both Bangladesh and the global approach to disaster management. The cyclone's unprecedented scale of destruction and loss of life prompted critical changes in how governments, organizations, and individuals prepare for and respond to natural disasters. Its legacy continues to shape policies and awareness to this day. One of the most significant outcomes of the Bhola cyclone was the heightened global focus on the importance of disaster preparedness. The tragedy highlighted glaring deficiencies in early warning systems and infrastructure. At the time, warnings for the cyclone were issued, but they failed to reach the vast majority of the population due to inadequate communication networks and the absence of a robust public information system. In response, both local and international entities began investing heavily in more effective early warning technologies, aiming to ensure that such a communication failure would not be repeated. For Bangladesh, which gained independence shortly after in 1971, the lessons of the cyclone were deeply embedded in the nation's development priorities. The newly formed government initiated efforts to build cyclone shelters, elevate infrastructure, and establish community-based warning systems. Over the following decades, thousands of multi-purpose cyclone shelters were constructed across the coastal regions, designed to provide refuge for large populations during future storms. Roads and embankments were also improved to offer better access and resilience against flooding. The Bhola Cyclone also played a crucial role in bringing international attention to the vulnerability of low-lying coastal regions. Scientists and policymakers began emphasizing the relationship between climate change and the increasing frequency and intensity of tropical cyclones. While the connection between human activity and global warming was not yet fully understood, in the 1970s, the Bhola disaster was an early indicator of the need to address environmental factors in disaster planning. On the human front, the cyclone sparked waves of political and social change within the region. The failure of the central government in West Pakistan to adequately respond to the needs of the affected areas in East Pakistan led to widespread outrage. This perceived neglect fueled the already growing demand for autonomy, culminating in the Bangladesh Liberation War and the country's eventual independence in 1971. The cyclone therefore not only left an indelible mark on the physical landscape, but also served as a catalyst for a monumental shift in the region's political history. Despite these advancements, the memory of the Bhola cyclone remains a stark reminder of the immense power of nature and the challenges of safeguarding human life in vulnerable regions. Each anniversary of the disaster serves as an opportunity to reflect on the strides made in disaster management and to acknowledge the ongoing risks faced by coastal communities around the world. Bangladesh itself, while vastly more prepared today, continues to confront new cyclones and rising sea levels, demonstrating the persistent need for vigilance and innovation. The Bhola cyclone story is one of immense tragedy, but also of resilience and transformation. The lives lost in November 1970 have left a legacy that has saved countless others by spurring improvements in disaster response and preparedness. This devastating event remains a powerful reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of nature's fury and the enduring importance of learning from the past to build a safer future. The story of the 2004 Indian Ocean Earthquake and Tsunami begins with one of the most intense geological events ever recorded. On December 26, 2004, a massive earthquake reaching a magnitude of 9.1 struck off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia. This earthquake was not just any seismic event, it was a mega-thrust earthquake, the type that occurs at subduction zones where one tectonic plate is forced beneath another. In this case, the Indian plate was thrust beneath the Burma plate, resulting in an enormous release of energy. This sudden and violent shift caused the Earth's crust to rupture along an underwater fault line stretching for over 900 miles. The scale of this event was extraordinary. The earthquake not only caused destruction near its epicenter, but also shifted the Earth's axis by nearly an inch and slightly sped up the planet's rotation. Such a significant change in Earth's mass distribution is rare and speaks to the sheer force of the event. This release of tectonic energy displaced an enormous volume of seawater above the fault line, setting off a series of waves that would become the infamous Indian Ocean Tsunami. Unlike ordinary waves, these tsunami waves moved with tremendous speed and were nearly undetectable on the ocean surface until they reached shallow coastal areas, where they rose to staggering heights. In the moments following the earthquake, scientists across the region began to sense its implications. The U.S. Geological Survey recorded the earthquake's initial shockwaves and immediately recognized the potential for a massive tsunami. In countries with advanced warning systems, alerts were quickly issued. However, in many parts of Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India, early warning systems were either non-existent or unable to reach affected communities in time. In the absence of rapid communication, many local residents remained unaware of the impending catastrophe, even as the waves began to move closer to their shores. What made this earthquake particularly destructive was its proximity to densely populated coastal areas. Southeast Asia is home to millions of people living along coastal communities, relying on the sea for their livelihoods and everyday life. These communities, which lined the beaches and fishing areas, were especially vulnerable. As the waves traveled across the Indian Ocean at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, they gathered tremendous force. People living in coastal towns and villages were largely unprepared for what was coming, unaware of the magnitude of the disaster that was building offshore. In this context, understanding the Indian Ocean's geological setup is crucial. The region is a hotspot for seismic activity, lying at the intersection of the Eurasian, Australian, and Indian tectonic plates. Throughout history, this area has experienced significant earthquakes, but none had been as intense or as devastating as this one. Prior events, such as the 1833 and 1907 earthquakes in Sumatra, had caused tsunamis that served as reminders of the region's vulnerability. However, nothing could have prepared these communities for the scale of destruction that would follow in the wake of the 2004 earthquake. In the aftermath of the initial tremor, many along the coast reported strange occurrences, such as the sudden retreat of the ocean from the shore. Fish were left flopping on exposed seabeds, and curious locals ventured out to gather them, unaware that the retreat of the water was a warning sign of a tsunami. This phenomenon, known as drawback, is a rare but telling signal of an incoming wave. Tragically, many did not understand this sign, and in the moments after the earthquake, as the ocean pulled back, many people, particularly children, rushed to the beach, oblivious to the approaching danger. As this unprecedented natural disaster began to unfold, a wave of unimaginable scale and force was forming and bearing down on some of the most populated coastlines in the Indian Ocean. In these first critical minutes after the earthquake, the fates of hundreds of thousands of people across multiple nations were being sealed, even before the deadly waters made landfall. As the initial tremors subsided, the communities along the Indian Ocean's coastlines were still largely unaware of the disaster headed their way. In the wake of the 9.1 magnitude earthquake off Sumatra, the displaced water from the ocean floor triggered a tsunami of unprecedented scale. Moving silently and swiftly, the tsunami waves raced across the Indian Ocean at speeds close to 500 miles per hour, essentially as fast as a jetliner, yet invisible from above the water's surface. By the time they neared land, they transformed into towering walls of water, ready to unleash devastation upon the unsuspecting coastlines. The tsunami first struck the shores of Banda Aceh, a city in Indonesia located close to the earthquake's epicenter. Within less than 30 minutes of the earthquake, the powerful waves hit with full force, crashing into the coast and obliterating everything in their path. Buildings, homes, and vehicles were swept away as the waves surged inland, consuming entire neighborhoods. People who had survived the initial shock of the earthquake suddenly found themselves confronted with a rapidly rising wall of water. Many attempted to flee to higher ground, but with little time and almost no warning, thousands of lives were lost in those first crucial moments. As the waves continued outward from Banda Aceh, they reached other parts of Southeast Asia and beyond. Thailand, renowned for its tourist beaches and coastal resorts, was next. In places like Phuket and Khao Lak, tourists and locals alike had only moments to respond as the waves began to rise. Videos captured that day show the first small surges of water rushing up the beaches, seemingly harmless as people continued to enjoy their day, unaware of the imminent danger. But in minutes, these small surges escalated into massive, unstoppable waves that inundated hotels, shops, and restaurants along the shore. The sheer force of the water overwhelmed everything, pulling people and debris out to sea. The devastation spread far beyond Southeast Asia. In Sri Lanka, approximately 1,000 miles from the earthquake's epicenter, coastal towns were suddenly hit with powerful waves several hours after the initial quake. The eastern coastline was particularly affected, with towns like Batticaloa and Ampara witnessing catastrophic damage as the ocean surged inland. Houses were flattened, infrastructure was destroyed, and countless lives were lost. Fishing communities, whose livelihoods depended on the sea, were among the hardest hit as the waves swept away boats, nets, and coastal settlements. India, located to the west of Indonesia, was also heavily impacted. In the state of Tamil Nadu, the waves struck fishing villages along the southeastern coast, while other parts of India, including Kerala and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, faced severe destruction. In Chennai, the capital of Tamil Nadu, floodwaters surged through the streets, reaching far into urban areas that were unprepared for such an event. In the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which lay close to the earthquake's epicenter, entire communities were left isolated as the tsunami decimated local infrastructure and cut off communication with the mainland. The waves didn't stop at South Asia. The impact of the tsunami extended across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as the eastern coast of Africa. In Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania, which are located thousands of miles from the earthquake's origin, the tsunami made landfall hours after the initial event, causing additional fatalities and destruction. While the impact in Africa was less severe than in Southeast Asia, the arrival of the waves was unexpected and devastating for those communities unaccustomed to such a disaster. Across the affected regions, the waves left behind unprecedented levels of destruction. Entire coastal villages were wiped out, homes and buildings were reduced to rubble, and thousands were separated from their families in the chaos. The power of the tsunami was such that it uprooted trees, overturned vehicles, and carried debris far inland. In a matter of hours, landscapes were transformed into scenes of desolation, with barely any structure left standing to mark the places that had once been vibrant communities. In this tragic moment, the resilience of the people was tested to its limits. Survivors found themselves in a sudden struggle for survival, searching for loved ones amidst the wreckage, and beginning to assess the true scale of the catastrophe. The Indian Ocean Tsunami was not just a natural disaster, it was a profound human tragedy, affecting communities across multiple countries and leaving a lasting impact on the millions of lives it touched. In the days following the Indian Ocean Tsunami, the full extent of the devastation began to emerge. Across the affected countries, an estimated 230,000 lives were lost, and millions of people found themselves homeless, with entire communities swept away. Survivors faced immediate challenges. Securing food, water, shelter, and medical aid became a critical priority, as local resources were overwhelmed by the unprecedented scale of the disaster. In Banda Aceh, one of the hardest-hit areas, the aftermath was particularly dire. Hospitals were overrun with the injured, and makeshift shelters sprang up as survivors sought refuge from the debris-strewn landscape. Streets were lined with displaced residents who had lost everything, including family members and friends. Infrastructure had been shattered, with roads, bridges, and communication lines wiped out, making it nearly impossible to transport essential supplies. The Indonesian government, local volunteers, and international relief teams worked around the clock to provide food, water, and medical care to survivors, but the needs were overwhelming. The human impact extended well beyond the immediate loss of life and property. Families were torn apart, with many children orphaned by the disaster. In Thailand, entire communities mourned as hundreds of children were reported missing or found alone, separated from their parents. The emotional toll was immense. People who had escaped the waves struggled with grief, trauma, and shock. Schools, places of worship, and homes had been reduced to rubble, leaving survivors with not only a physical void, but a profound sense of loss. In Sri Lanka, the eastern coast had suffered extensive damage, with hundreds of fishing villages decimated. Survivors there faced unique challenges, as fishing was the main livelihood in these areas. Boats, equipment, and infrastructure essential to their work were destroyed, leaving families without a source of income and dependent on outside assistance. Efforts to provide aid were complicated by Sri Lanka's geography and the limited accessibility of many affected areas. Roads had been flooded or damaged, making it difficult for humanitarian organizations to reach the worst-hit regions. Despite the challenges, the international community rallied to provide support, with rescue teams and volunteers arriving to assist in the relief efforts. In India, the state of Tamil Nadu was among the hardest-hit areas. Coastal towns and cities were grappling with a severe shortage of clean drinking water and food, and local hospitals were stretched to their limits. Emergency response teams from within the country mobilized quickly, setting up camps and temporary housing for those displaced by the disaster. However, the sheer number of people in need made it an enormous logistical challenge, and resources were spread thin. Many of those affected were members of fishing communities, who found themselves not only dealing with loss and displacement, but also with the destruction of their livelihoods. Across the Indian Ocean, the widespread impact was a reminder of the interconnectedness of these coastal communities. Even in distant locations like Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania, the waves caused damage, with coastal residents enduring flooding, property damage, and loss of life. Though the destruction in Africa was less severe than in Asia, it highlighted the far-reaching effects of the tsunami and underscored the need for a coordinated global response to disasters of this scale. In response to the catastrophe, international aid poured into the affected countries. Governments, organizations, and individuals worldwide joined in the relief efforts, raising billions of dollars to assist those in need. Aid agencies, including the United Nations, Red Cross, and numerous NGOs, mobilized swiftly to provide medical aid, food, shelter, and other necessities. Helicopters were used to reach remote areas inaccessible by land, delivering much-needed supplies and evacuating the injured. Volunteers from all over the world arrived to help rebuild and support the survivors, while local authorities worked to coordinate the influx of aid. For the survivors, recovery would take years, and rebuilding shattered communities was an enormous task. Many people faced long-term challenges, from psychological trauma to the loss of livelihoods, and the need for resources to rebuild homes, schools, and infrastructure was immense. The 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami not only reshaped the physical landscape, but also left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of those affected, a lasting reminder of nature's power and the resilience of the human spirit.